Before we dive into one of the most bizarre and terrifying stories from the Second World War, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that like button because what you're about to hear will leave you absolutely speechless. This is a tale that has remained buried in dusty archives for decades, a story so insane that even Hollywood would struggle to make it believable, yet every single word of it is true. We're talking about a German soldier who made a decision so desperate, so utterly mad, that it defies all logic and reason. A man who literally carried death itself inside his uniform as he ran from the front lines, knowing that one wrong move, one stumble, one piece of bad luck would turn him into nothing more than a red mist and scattered pieces across the frozen Russian landscape. But to understand why this soldier did what he did, why he chose to embrace such an insane risk, we need to go back to the beginning, to the winter of 1942, when the Eastern Front had become a frozen hell that consumed men and machines with equal appetite, when the Wehrmacht's dreams of quick victory had turned into a nightmare of endless snow, bitter cold, and Soviet counterattacks that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had begun with such promise in June of 1941, with 3 million German soldiers smashing across the border, convinced they would be in Moscow before the leaves fell from the trees. They had been told the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse with one good kick, that the Slavic peoples were inferior, that their military was incompetent, and that victory was not just possible, but inevitable. For months it seemed like the propaganda might actually be true as German panzers rolled across the endless steppes, encircling entire Soviet armies, capturing millions of prisoners, and driving deeper and deeper into enemy territory. The soldiers wrote home about their victories, about how they would be back for Christmas, about how the war in the East was already won. But then the autumn rains came, turning the roads into rivers of mud that swallowed vehicles whole, and before anyone could properly prepare, the Russian winter descended like a hammer from hell itself. The Germans had expected a short campaign and had not prepared for winter warfare. So soldiers froze in their summer uniforms. Their vehicles refused to start in the sub-zero temperatures. Their weapons jammed and malfunctioned. And worst of all, the Red Army that was supposed to have collapsed had instead regrouped, reinforced, and was now hitting back with a fury born of desperation and righteous anger at having their homeland invaded. By December of 1941, the Germans had been stopped cold just miles from Moscow, and that stop turned into a retreat as fresh Siberian divisions, men who actually knew how to fight in winter, came pouring in to drive them back. The retreat was chaos, pure and simple, with units breaking apart, soldiers abandoning equipment that wouldn't function in the cold, men dying not from bullets, but from frostbite and exposure, their bodies left frozen in the snow because there was no time to bury them and no strength left to carry them. Officers lost control of their men, discipline broke down, and the mighty Wehrmacht that had conquered most of Europe in a matter of months was now running for its life through a white wilderness that killed as efficiently as any weapon. Hitler, furious at the retreat, fired his generals and issued a series of insane stand-fast orders, demanding that German soldiers hold every position to the last man, refusing to allow tactical withdrawals even when they made perfect military sense. This meant that when positions did become untenable, when retreat became the only option for survival, soldiers were faced with a terrible choice between obeying orders that would get them killed or disobeying and facing execution for cowardice or desertion. Make sure you hit that like button if you're enjoying this story so far, because it's about to get even more intense. Our story specifically begins in a sector near Rzhev, a city that would become synonymous with some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war, a meat grinder that consumed divisions like a hungry beast and gave back nothing but frozen corpses and shattered minds. The Rzhev salient was a bulge in the German lines that stuck deep into Soviet territory, and Stalin was absolutely obsessed with eliminating it, throwing attack after attack at the Germans holding the salient, while Hitler was equally obsessed with holding it, seeing it as a dagger pointed at Moscow that must be kept in place no matter the cost. The result was months of horrific combat in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance, fighting in forests and villages where the temperature regularly dropped to 30 or 40 degrees below zero, where men's fingers froze to their triggers, where the wounded died in minutes if they couldn't be evacuated immediately, and where every day was a struggle just to stay alive before even considering the enemy trying to kill you. In this hellish landscape, we find our protagonist, though calling him a protagonist might be too generous considering what he was fighting for, a young German soldier we'll call Franz, though that wasn't his real name, a man who had joined the Wehrmacht with dreams of glory and adventure, but who had found instead only horror and desperation. Franz had been on the Eastern Front for 8 months by the time our story takes place, and those 8 months had aged him a lifetime, transforming him from a fresh-faced volunteer into a haggard survivor with dead eyes and hands that shook constantly from a combination of cold and trauma. He had watched friends die in dozens of different ways, had killed more men than he could count or wanted to remember, had endured conditions that would have seemed impossible if he hadn't lived through them himself. And somewhere along the way, he had lost whatever idealism or sense of purpose had brought him to Russia in the first place. Now he was just trying to survive, to make it through one more day, one more hour, one more minute in a war that seemed like it would never end. His unit, what was left of it anyway, was holding a position in a stretch of frozen forest where the trees stood like skeletal sentinels, and the snow was so deep that moving anywhere required exhausting effort. They were supposed to be holding the line, but everyone knew that holding meant dying slowly because the Soviets were preparing another offensive, bringing up fresh troops and supplies while the Germans had nothing coming, no reinforcements, no winter equipment, barely enough food and ammunition to last another week. The men in Franz's unit talked in whispers about retreating, about falling back to more defensible positions, but their officers had made it clear that retreat without orders meant execution, that Hitler himself had demanded they hold, and that anyone who suggested otherwise would be shot for defeatism. So they stayed in their frozen holes, wrapped in whatever they could find for warmth, watching the dark forest and waiting for the inevitable attack they knew was coming. The attack came on a morning so cold that breath froze in the air and any exposed skin would develop frostbite in minutes, coming not with any warning but suddenly, explosively, as Soviet artillery began hammering their positions with a fury that suggested this wasn't going to be just another probing attack, but a full-scale assault designed to break through and encircle them. Franz and his comrades huddled in their trenches as shells screamed in, throwing up geysers of frozen earth and shattered trees, the noise so loud that thought became impossible, the fear so intense that some men simply broke, curling into balls and whimpering while others fired their weapons blindly into the forest, not aiming at anything, but just needing to do something, anything, to feel like they had some control over their fate. When the artillery finally lifted, it was only because the Soviet infantry was coming, masses of white-clad soldiers emerging from the trees like ghosts, their shouts of "Ura!" cutting through the frozen air as they charged the German positions with a ferocity born of defending their homeland. The Germans opened fire, their machine guns cutting down the first waves, but there were always more coming, always another wave, another attack, the Soviets willing to trade lives for ground in a calculus that the undermanned German defenders couldn't match. Franz fired until his rifle barrel was hot enough to melt snow, until his shoulder ached from the recoil, until his ears rang so badly he couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched whine, and still they kept coming. Around him men fell, some killed instantly by bullets or shrapnel, others wounded and screaming for medics that weren't coming because the medics were dead or busy with others or had simply run out of supplies to treat anyone with. The position was being overrun, that much was clear, but the officers kept screaming for them to hold, to fight, to die in place if necessary, because those were the orders from above. It was in this moment of absolute chaos and terror that Franz saw his opportunity, or perhaps better said, was pushed beyond the point where rational thought controlled his actions and pure survival instinct took over. During a brief lull in the fighting, as both sides caught their breath and prepared for the next exchange of violence, Franz found himself in a destroyed bunker that had taken a direct hit from Soviet artillery, the kind of hit that had collapsed one wall and filled the interior with debris and destruction. Lying among that debris, half buried in frozen dirt and splintered wood, was an unexploded German stick grenade, one of the distinctive potato masher-style weapons that the Wehrmacht used, a weapon that should have detonated but for whatever reason had not, whether due to a faulty fuse, damage from the artillery blast, or simple bad luck? Franz stared at that grenade for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities and probabilities, knowing that touching it could mean instant death if it decided to detonate, but also knowing that staying in this position meant certain death anyway when the next Soviet wave came. Leave a comment below telling me if you would have made the same choice Franz did, because what he decided to do next was absolutely insane. Franz picked up the grenade with trembling hands, expecting at any second to be blown apart. But nothing happened, the weapon remaining inert in his grip, though whether it was truly safe or simply hadn't detonated yet was impossible to know. The stick grenade was a simple weapon in design, with an explosive head attached to a wooden handle that contained the pull cord for activating the fuse. But this one had been damaged somehow, the handle cracked and the head dented, and Franz had no way of knowing if it was stable or if the slightest movement would set it off. A sane man would have left it where it lay, would have found another way to survive, or would have accepted his fate. But Franz was no longer sane, not after 8 months of watching friends die, not after weeks of freezing in holes in the ground, not after enduring the constant terror of life on the Eastern Front. He looked at that grenade and saw not a weapon but a ticket out, a way to escape the front lines that didn't involve the cowardice of simply running away, because if he ran he would be caught and shot. But if he claimed to be wounded, to have taken shrapnel from the bombardment, maybe, just maybe, he could get evacuated to the rear. But simply claiming injury wouldn't work, not with officers who were paranoid about malingerers and deserters, not when every man was needed on the line. No, Franz needed his wound to be real, or at least convincing enough that no one would question it. And that's when the truly insane idea came to him. He would carry the grenade with him, hide it in his uniform, and use it somehow to create a convincing wound, or at least to make it seem like he had been injured badly enough to warrant evacuation. The plan was barely a plan at all, more of a desperate gamble, but desperation makes men do insane things, and Franz was beyond desperate. He carefully, so carefully, tucked the damaged grenade inside his uniform jacket, wedging it between the inner and outer layers of cloth where it would be hidden from casual observation, but where he could feel it pressing against his chest, a constant reminder of the death he was carrying with him. Every heartbeat felt like it might be his last. Every breath could be the one that somehow triggered the detonation, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, to move carefully, to project an image of calm even as terror churned in his gut. The fighting resumed before Franz could put any kind of real plan into action, the Soviets launching another assault that hit the German lines like a tsunami of white-clad soldiers and T-34 tanks that had somehow made it through the forest. This was it, the final push, and everyone knew it, the moment when the position would either hold or break completely. Franz's officers were screaming for everyone to stay in position, to fight to the last bullet, but Franz had already made his decision. When the man next to him took a bullet to the head and collapsed into the bottom of the trench, Franz used that moment of confusion and horror to make his move. He scrambled out of the trench, not toward the enemy, but away, moving as fast as he could through the deep snow while other soldiers were too focused on the attack to notice one more man moving in the chaos. He ran hunched over, expecting at any moment to feel a bullet in his back or to have the grenade detonate and end everything. But neither happened, and within minutes he had put enough distance between himself and the fighting that the sounds of battle became muffled and distant. Franz kept moving, following a small trail through the forest that he remembered from patrols, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his legs burning from the effort of running through snow that was often waist-deep, and all the while the grenade pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat, a reminder that his life was literally hanging by a thread or a fuse or whatever was keeping that thing from exploding. He had no clear destination in mind, just away, anywhere that wasn't the front line, anywhere that offered even the slightest hope of survival. The forest around him was silent except for his own labored breathing and the crunch of snow under his boots, an eerie quiet that felt wrong after months of constant noise from artillery, gunfire, and shouting. It was in this silence that the full weight of what he had done began to sink in, that he had deserted his post, that he was carrying a live explosive against his body, that he had no plan beyond running and hoping. Hit that subscribe button if you want to find out what happens next, because Franz's ordeal is far from over. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes, Franz stopped to catch his breath, leaning against a snow-covered pine tree while his heart hammered in his chest and his lungs burned from the cold air. He was completely alone in a vast forest in the middle of winter, carrying a weapon that could kill him at any moment, with no clear idea of where he was going or what he would do when he got there. Behind him, he could still hear the distant sounds of battle, the crump of artillery and the rattle of machine gun fire, and he wondered if his unit was still holding or if they had been overrun, if anyone had noticed he was gone, or if they were all too busy dying to care. The guilt was there, hovering at the edges of his consciousness, the knowledge that he had abandoned his comrades, but he pushed it down, buried it beneath the more immediate concern of survival. He couldn't go back, that much was certain, because going back meant death either from the Soviets or from his own officers who would execute him for desertion, so forward was the only option, even if he had no idea what forward meant. Franz started moving again, this time more carefully, trying to conserve energy and avoid drawing attention to himself if anyone happened to be nearby. The problem was that he was still in German-held territory, technically, though held was a generous term for these frozen forests where control was fluid and unit positions changed by the hour. He needed to reach a rear area, somewhere with medical facilities where he could claim to have been wounded and separated from his unit during the chaos of battle, but getting there meant traveling through several miles of contested ground where Soviet infiltrators, partisans, and scattered German units all roamed. Every shadow could be an enemy, every sound could be danger, and all the while he had a live grenade pressed against his chest that could end everything in an instant. The sheer insanity of his situation would have been funny if it wasn't so terrifying, and Franz found himself on the edge of hysterical laughter more than once as he stumbled through the snow, wondering if this was how he was going to die, not from enemy action, but from the weapon he was carrying to save himself. The sun was beginning to set, what little of it had been visible through the heavy clouds, and Franz knew he needed to find shelter soon because spending a night exposed in these temperatures would kill him as surely as any bullet. He spotted what looked like an abandoned peasant cottage through the trees, a small structure that was half collapsed but still offered more protection than the open forest. He approached carefully, watching for any signs of occupation, but the cottage appeared empty, its former inhabitants either fled, evacuated, or dead, one more casualty of a war that had consumed everything in its path. Inside, the cottage was barely warmer than outside, but it blocked the wind, and that was something. Franz found a corner that seemed relatively intact and collapsed into it, exhausted beyond measure, every muscle in his body screaming in protest, and only then did he allow himself to really think about the grenade still pressed against his chest. Very, very carefully, Franz reached inside his jacket and withdrew the weapon, holding it at arm's length as if distance would somehow make it less dangerous. In the dim light filtering through the broken walls, he could see the damage more clearly, the dented head, the cracked handle, the pull cord that dangled loose in a way that suggested the mechanism inside might be compromised. This thing should probably have exploded already, he thought, and the fact that it hadn't was either a miracle or a sign that his luck was about to run out. He knew he should get rid of it, throw it out into the snow and leave it behind, but he also knew that the grenade was his only proof of injury, his only plausible explanation for why he had left the front lines. If he arrived at a rear area with no wounds and no weapon, he would be questioned, possibly arrested, and almost certainly sent back to the line or worse. But if he could use the grenade somehow, create a small wound that looked convincing, then maybe he could sell his story. The problem was how to use it without killing himself, and Franz spent the next hour turning the grenade over in his hands, examining it from every angle, trying to figure out if there was a way to control its detonation, to direct the blast away from himself while still close enough to cause minor injuries. He had seen men wounded by grenade fragments before, had seen the distinctive pattern of small puncture wounds and burns that came from being too close to an explosion, and he knew that was what he needed to replicate. But intentionally triggering a damaged grenade while trying to control its effects was insane, possibly even more insane than carrying it through the forest, because at least while carrying it he could stay still and minimize movement, whereas using it required actively doing something that would likely kill him. Franz set the grenade down and put his head in his hands, feeling the weight of his choices pressing down on him, wondering if he had simply exchanged one form of death for another. He must have dozed off despite himself. Exhaustion, overwhelming fear. Because when he opened his eyes, the cottage was completely dark, and the sounds of movement outside snapped him to full alertness. Franz froze, listening intently, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle he had abandoned back at the trench before remembering it wasn't there. The footsteps crunched through the snow outside, multiple people from the sound of it, and voices speaking in low tones, voices that Franz realized with a jolt were speaking Russian. Partisans or Soviet soldiers. It didn't matter which. They were the enemy, and he was alone and unarmed except for a grenade that might or might not explode if he tried to use it. The voices grew louder, closer, and Franz knew they were going to check the cottage, knew that his hiding place was about to become a trap. He grabbed the grenade, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it, and pressed himself into the darkest corner, praying that somehow they would miss him, that somehow he could remain invisible. The door burst open, weak moonlight silhouetting two figures, and Franz could see they were carrying rifles, Soviet rifles from the distinctive shape, and they were speaking to each other, probably commenting on the abandoned cottage. One of them had a torch, a weak beam that cut through the darkness, and Franz knew that in seconds that beam would find him and it would all be over. In that moment, with terror overriding thought, Franz's fingers found the pull cord of the grenade, the cord that would start the fuse, and he pulled it, heard the pop of the mechanism activating, and threw the grenade with all his strength toward the opposite corner of the cottage while simultaneously diving through a gap in the collapsed wall behind him. The explosion came instantly, far faster than it should have, so fast that Franz barely made it through the gap before the blast wave picked him up and threw him into the snow outside, his ears ringing, his vision white, pain lancing through his back and legs where fragments had hit him. Make sure you comment below whether you think Franz survived, because his story is about to take another incredible turn. Franz lay in the snow, stunned, unable to hear anything over the ringing in his ears, unable to think clearly through the shock and pain. He was alive. Somehow he was alive, though parts of him hurt in ways he had never experienced before. He forced himself to move, crawling through the snow away from the cottage, expecting at any moment to hear gunfire or shouting as the Soviets recovered and came after him. But there was nothing, just silence broken only by the ringing in his ears. He crawled until he couldn't crawl anymore, until his arms gave out, and he collapsed face first into a snowdrift. And there he stayed, consciousness fading in and out, pain washing over him in waves, the cold seeping into his bones and promising the kind of sleep that never ended. He might have died there, probably should have died there, but fate or luck or whatever force governs such things wasn't done with Franz yet. He woke to hands grabbing him, rolling him over, and voices speaking German, blessed German, the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Through vision that refused to focus properly, Franz could see Wehrmacht uniforms, could see the concerned faces of soldiers who were checking him for injuries, and he tried to speak, but his mouth wouldn't form words. They were asking him questions, who he was, what unit he was from, what had happened, and Franz managed to croak out a story, a lie mixed with truth, about being separated from his unit during a Soviet attack, about being wounded by a grenade, about trying to find his way back to German lines. The soldiers, a patrol that had been sent out to check for stragglers and survivors, seemed to accept his story at face value, probably because he was clearly wounded and in shock, and they carefully loaded him onto a makeshift stretcher to carry him back to their base. The next few days passed in a blur of pain and confusion as Franz was moved from a frontline aid station to a field hospital further back, where doctors removed shrapnel from his back and legs, treated him for frostbite and exposure, and kept asking him questions about what had happened. Franz stuck to his story, elaborating on details when necessary, but keeping it simple, claiming that the chaos of battle had separated him from his unit, that he had been wounded by a Soviet grenade during an attack, that he had wandered through the forest trying to find friendly forces. The doctors and officers seemed satisfied with his explanation, or perhaps they simply had too many other wounded men to worry about and didn't want to waste time investigating one more confused and traumatized soldier. Franz was classified as wounded in action, given the appropriate paperwork, and told he would be evacuated further west once he was stable enough to travel. Lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by other wounded men, Franz should have felt relief, should have felt grateful that his insane gamble had somehow worked. but instead he felt only a numb emptiness. He had survived, yes, but at what cost? He had deserted his comrades, had abandoned his post, had carried a live explosive against his body in a gamble with death, and had used it in a way that had probably killed 2 Soviet soldiers in that cottage, men who were also just trying to survive this horrible war. The grenade that he had carried with such fear, that had pressed against his chest like a ticking time bomb, had ultimately saved his life by providing him with real wounds that legitimized his story, but it had also marked him in ways that no scar could show. He never told anyone the full truth of what happened, never admitted to carrying the grenade deliberately, never spoke of his desertion or his calculated plan to wound himself to escape the front. Franz eventually recovered enough to be transferred to a hospital in Germany, far from the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. And as the war dragged on, he was assigned to rear area duties, training new recruits, and working in logistics, never sent back to combat, because his wounds were deemed serious enough to warrant permanent reassignment. He survived the war, survived the collapse of Nazi Germany, survived the chaos of the post-war period, and eventually built a quiet life for himself, never speaking of his experiences, never telling anyone about the day he carried death itself inside his uniform and somehow lived to tell about it. It was only years later, in old age, that he finally told his story to a historian researching lesser-known incidents from the Eastern Front, and even then he insisted on anonymity, unwilling to have his real name associated with what he had done. The historian who recorded his testimony noted that Franz seemed haunted by his choices, that he spoke with a mixture of shame and defiance, admitting that what he did was cowardly and desperate, but also insisting that anyone who hadn't been there, who hadn't experienced the absolute hell of the Eastern Front in winter, had no right to judge him. The story of Franz and his grenade raises uncomfortable questions about survival, desperation, and the choices men make when pushed to their absolute limits. Was he a coward for deserting his post? Or was he simply doing what any rational person would do when faced with certain death? Was his decision to carry a live grenade against his body an act of insane courage or desperate madness? There are no easy answers, and that's what makes this story so fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. War, especially a war as brutal as the Eastern Front in World War II, strips away all the comfortable illusions we have about courage and cowardice, about right and wrong, and reveals human nature in its rawest form. Men like Franz were placed in situations that no one should ever have to face, forced to make choices between bad options and worse options, and judging those choices from the comfort and safety of the present day is both necessary and deeply unfair. What we do know is that Franz was far from the only German soldier who deserted or who wounded himself to escape combat on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht executed thousands of its own soldiers for desertion, cowardice, and self-inflicted wounds during the war, with the Eastern Front accounting for a disproportionate number of these executions. The conditions were so horrific, the casualties so immense, the leadership so incompetent and cruel, that men broke in large numbers, choosing the risk of execution over the certainty of death in combat. German military records, those that survived the war at least, are full of cases of soldiers found with self-inflicted wounds, men who shot themselves in the foot or hand, who exposed themselves to frostbite deliberately, who did anything they could think of to escape the front lines. The military authorities were well aware of this problem and took brutal measures to combat it, not by improving conditions or providing adequate support, but by increasing the penalties for desertion and making examples of those caught trying to escape. Franz's method was unusual in its sheer audacity and danger, carrying a live explosive for hours, but the desperation that drove him was absolutely typical of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who found themselves trapped in a nightmare not of their own making. It's important to remember, though, that these men were fighting for one of the most evil regimes in human history, that the Wehrmacht was deeply complicit in Nazi atrocities including the Holocaust, and that the invasion of the Soviet Union was a war of annihilation designed to enslave or exterminate millions of people. Understanding why individual soldiers like Franz made the choices they did doesn't mean excusing the larger cause they were fighting for, and any sympathy for their suffering must be balanced against the far greater suffering they and their fellow soldiers inflicted on others. The Soviets who were defending their homeland, the civilians who were murdered, starved, and enslaved. The millions who died because of Nazi aggression. They are the real victims of this story, not the German soldiers who suffered from their own government's criminal decisions. Still, on a purely human level, the story of a man so desperate to survive that he carried a live bomb against his body for hours, knowing that at any second it could detonate and kill him, is extraordinary. Think about the psychology required to make that choice. To pick up a damaged explosive and tuck it into your jacket, to walk and run with it pressing against your chest, to feel it there with every step and every breath and every heartbeat, knowing that this could be your last moment of existence. The level of fear that Franz must have experienced is almost impossible to imagine, and the fact that he somehow remained functional enough to move, to think, to eventually use the weapon, speaks to either incredible mental strength or complete psychological breakdown, possibly both at once. Fear does strange things to people, and in extreme situations it can either paralyze completely or drive actions that seem superhuman in their daring or insanity. The Eastern Front produced countless stories of desperation and survival, of men pushed far beyond what should be endurable, and Franz's story is just one among millions. But it stands out for its sheer strangeness and the intimate nature of the danger he carried. Most soldiers face death from external sources, from bullets and shells and cold, from enemies and elements. But Franz chose to carry his potential death with him, to make it personal in a way that most combat never is. There's something almost philosophical about that choice, about literally embracing the instrument of your possible destruction as a means of potential salvation, about making death your companion in the hope that it might somehow spare you. It's the kind of thing that sounds profound in retrospect, but was probably just blind panic and desperate improvisation in the moment. But it worked, against all odds and logic. It actually worked. If you've made it this far in the video, please hit that like button and leave a comment telling me what you think about Franz's choice, because I'm genuinely curious whether you would have done the same thing in his position. Would you have picked up that grenade? Would you have carried it for hours? Would you have had the nerve to actually use it the way he did? And make sure you're subscribed because we're going to be bringing you more incredible, unbelievable, and absolutely true stories from World War II that you won't find anywhere else. These are the stories that didn't make it into the history books, the personal tales of individual soldiers and civilians who experienced the war in ways that are both extraordinary and terrifyingly human. The Second World War was the largest and deadliest conflict in human history, involving tens of millions of soldiers and resulting in perhaps 70 to 85 million deaths. And behind every one of those statistics is a personal story, a human being who lived and suffered and made choices, good and bad, in circumstances that tested the limits of human endurance and morality. Franz's story also highlights the often overlooked reality that not all soldiers were heroes, that many were simply trying to survive, and that survival often required moral compromises and actions that would be condemned in any other context. The mythology of war, especially as portrayed in movies and books, tends to emphasize courage, sacrifice, and noble suffering. But the reality on the ground was often far messier, far more morally ambiguous, and far more desperate than those clean narratives suggest. Men like Franz existed in a gray area between hero and coward, between victim and perpetrator, and understanding that complexity is essential to understanding war itself. He wasn't fighting for freedom or defending his homeland. He was part of an invading army engaged in a criminal war, but he was also a human being trapped in a situation beyond his control, trying to stay alive in conditions that killed men by the thousands every day. The fact that Franz carried that grenade through the forest, that he slept with it in the abandoned cottage, that he had it with him when the Soviet soldiers entered, raises another interesting question about whether he intended from the beginning to use it as a weapon or whether that was a split-second decision made in terror when he was discovered. His own account suggested that he had planned to use it to wound himself, to create injuries that would justify his evacuation, but when faced with immediate danger he threw it at the enemy instead, an action that both saved his life and created the wounds he needed to sell his story. Whether this was calculated or instinctive is impossible to know, and Franz himself probably couldn't have said for certain, because in moments of extreme stress and danger the line between thought and action, between plan and impulse, becomes blurred beyond recognition. What's particularly interesting from a historical perspective is how Franz's story illustrates the breakdown of German military effectiveness on the Eastern Front by late 1942 and early 1943. The Wehrmacht that invaded the Soviet Union had been a highly disciplined, well-equipped, and confident force, but the combination of Soviet resistance, the brutal winter, massive casualties, and strategic failures had transformed it into something far less effective. Desertion rates were climbing, morale was collapsing, soldiers were losing faith in their leadership, and the much-vaunted German military discipline was cracking under the strain. Stories like Franz's, of soldiers abandoning their posts and taking desperate measures to escape combat, were symptoms of a larger crisis that would only worsen as the war continued and the tide turned definitively against Germany. By the time the war ended, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers had deserted, surrendered, or found other ways to escape combat, a fact that is often glossed over in accounts that focus on German military prowess and fighting spirit. The aftermath of Franz's experience, his evacuation and eventual assignment to rear duties, was itself a form of escape that many German soldiers desperately sought, but few achieved. Being classified as wounded in action with injuries severe enough to prevent frontline service was like winning a lottery, a ticket away from almost certain death into relative safety in the rear areas or back in Germany. The fact that Franz achieved this through a combination of desertion, carrying a live explosive, and ultimately using it in circumstances that were at least partly of his own making, adds layers of irony and moral complexity to his survival. He saved his own life through actions that violated military law and personal ethics, but from his perspective, from the viewpoint of a man trapped in hell and trying to escape by any means necessary, those violations were entirely justified. Whether we agree with that justification depends on our own moral framework and our willingness to imagine ourselves in his situation, which is a thought experiment most of us would rather not conduct. One aspect of Franz's story that deserves particular attention is the sheer randomness of survival in war, the way that tiny choices and accidents of fate determine who lives and who dies. If the grenade had detonated when he first picked it up, if he had been spotted leaving the trench, if the patrol that found him had been Soviet instead of German, if the doctors had been more suspicious of his story, if any of a dozen other variables had been slightly different, Franz would have died and his story would have died with him. Just another unknown casualty among millions. The fact that he survived, that he was able to tell his story decades later, was largely a matter of luck rather than skill or deserving, which is true for most survival stories from war. We remember and tell the stories of survivors while forgetting that for every Franz who made it through there were dozens or hundreds who didn't. Men who made similar choices or showed similar courage or desperation, but whose luck ran out at some critical moment. The psychological impact of carrying that grenade, of living with that level of fear for hours, must have been profound even beyond the obvious trauma of combat and the Eastern Front generally. Franz was essentially playing Russian roulette with his own life. Except instead of having 1 chance in 6 of dying, he probably had closer to a 50-50 chance, or worse, every moment he carried that damaged explosive. The hypervigilance required to move carefully enough not to trigger detonation, the constant awareness of death literally pressed against his chest, the inability to escape or relax even for a moment, these would have created a level of stress that few people ever experience. That he remained functional enough to keep moving, to eventually use the weapon, and to maintain his cover story afterwards suggests either remarkable mental resilience or some form of dissociative state, where his conscious mind partially detached from the horror of his situation. Either way, the experience would have left psychological scars that likely never fully healed, adding to the already considerable trauma of months of combat on the Eastern Front. Modern readers might wonder why Franz didn't simply surrender to the Soviets, why he went through the elaborate and dangerous charade of carrying a grenade and creating the appearance of wounds rather than just walking into Soviet lines and giving up. The answer lies in the propaganda both sides had fed their soldiers about how prisoners would be treated and in the very real dangers of trying to surrender on the Eastern Front where quarter was often neither asked nor given. German soldiers had been told that Soviet captivity meant torture and death, and while this was propaganda, it also contained enough truth to make surrender a genuinely frightening prospect. Soviet treatment of German prisoners, especially early in the war when emotions were running highest, was often brutal, with many prisoners dying from exposure, starvation, or execution, particularly SS men or those suspected of war crimes. Franz, as a regular Wehrmacht soldier, might have survived Soviet captivity, but he had no way of knowing that for certain, and the risk of surrendering probably seemed as great or greater than the risk of carrying the grenade and trying to reach German lines. The final irony of Franz's story is that his desperate act of desertion and self-preservation ultimately allowed him to survive the war and build a life afterward, while many of the soldiers who stayed at their posts, who followed orders and showed what military authorities would call courage and discipline, died in the frozen forests and snow-covered fields of the Eastern Front. Their names carved on memorials if they were lucky, or simply added to lists of missing presumed dead if they were not. In a purely utilitarian sense, Franz made the right choice because he lived, but that doesn't make it the morally right choice or the choice that a society can function with everyone making. If every soldier deserted when conditions became difficult, armies would collapse and wars would be lost. But if every soldier stays and fights when their cause is unjust and their situation hopeless, then we're asking people to die for no good reason. Where the line falls between duty and self-preservation, between courage and foolishness, between following orders and following conscience, these are questions that every generation of soldiers has had to grapple with, and there are no universal answers that apply in all situations. Before we wrap up this incredible story, I want you to imagine for just a moment being in Franz's position, feeling that grenade against your chest, knowing that every step could be your last, that every breath might be the one that somehow triggers the explosion that turns you into fragments scattered across the snow. Imagine the fear, the constant terror that would override every other thought, the way your hands would shake, the way your heart would hammer in your chest, the way you would move so carefully, so precisely, trying to minimize any movement that might set it off. Imagine carrying that for not just minutes, but hours. Imagine trying to sleep with it. Imagine running with it pressed against your body. The mental image alone is terrifying, but Franz actually lived it, actually experienced those hours of mortal terror, and somehow came out the other side alive. That's what makes this story so remarkable. Not that he deserted or that he survived, but that he endured that specific form of intimate danger and remained sane enough to function. The broader historical context makes Franz's story even more significant because it represents a pattern that was playing out across the entire Eastern Front by late 1942, with German soldiers increasingly desperate to escape combat through any means available. The winter of 1942-43 was particularly brutal, with the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, where an entire German army was surrounded and destroyed, serving as a turning point that made it clear to many soldiers that Germany was going to lose the war. Once that realization set in, the willingness to die for the cause dropped dramatically, and survival became the primary goal for many men who could see no point in sacrificing themselves for a lost cause. Franz's actions, viewed in this context, were not those of an isolated coward but part of a larger wave of desertions, self-inflicted wounds, and surrenders that reflected the collapsing morale of the German military in the East. In the end, Franz's story is about fear, desperation, and the will to survive, universal human experiences that transcend the specific historical context of World War II. While we can and should condemn the cause he was fighting for and acknowledge the terrible crimes committed by the German military in the Soviet Union, we can also recognize that on an individual human level, the choice to try to survive rather than die in a frozen forest was understandable, if not necessarily admirable. The method he chose, carrying a live explosive in his uniform, was insane and desperate and incredibly dangerous, but it worked, and in the end, that's what mattered to Franz. He survived, he went home, he lived to old age, and for a soldier on the Eastern Front in World War II, that alone was a kind of victory, even if it came at the cost of his honor and the abandonment of his comrades. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most bizarre and terrifying stories from World War II, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and leave a comment telling me what other lesser-known stories from the war you'd like to hear about. We're committed to bringing you the stories that didn't make it into the mainstream history books, the personal accounts of individuals who experienced the war in extraordinary ways, and there are countless more tales waiting to be told. World War II was full of moments of courage and cowardice, of heroism and horror, of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and every one of those stories deserves to be remembered and examined. Franz's story of carrying death inside his uniform is just one among millions, but it's a story that captures something essential about the desperate nature of survival in war and the lengths to which people will go when pushed to their absolute limits. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore another incredible untold story from history's greatest conflict.